I think having an event like tonight is just a wonderful, wonderful opportunity, particularly for us as speakers. You know, we spend all of our lives away on expeditions and we get together this incredible repository of anecdotes and stories, and they tend to just disappear and dissipate. And having an opportunity to use them for a cause, you know, to put them out there, have people listen to them, and for that to raise money for good causes is fantastic. In this company tonight, we've obviously got some of the finest adventurers and expeditioners in the world. So I figured to talk about my own expeditions would be a little bit like trying to sell ice to the Inuits, or a little bit like talking about, I don't know, a Sunday afternoon stroll up Snowdonia. So I thought I'd try something a little bit different. Instead, I'm going to try a little bit of audience participation. How does that sound? Decidedly lukewarm. It's very, very different talking to adults to kids, isn't it? So this could be disastrous. Right, okay, what I'm going to do is I need you all to shout out an animal. And in response to that animal, I'm going to try and come up with an anecdote, a story from our many years of filming with animals. And if I can't do that, then I'll try and give you some tenuous, interesting facts about it. So, over to you all. Give me an animal. All I heard was, rhino. Anaconda, that's a great one. Okay, fantastic. Well, yeah, I know, but anaconda, I've got a better story about anaconda than I have about rhino, so I'm going to go for that one. So the green anaconda is the world's largest species of snake. The reticulated python is probably slightly longer, but a fully grown female green anaconda can be as fat around as my waist and can be 6 meters in length. This is a snake that lives almost its entire life in the water. And I had been filming them above the water for many years with limited success, because you always have to wade around in the mud, grab a hold of them and then kind of pull them out of the mud. And by the time you've done that, they've lost all of their natural behavior. They're not behaving as a snake would do, living its normal life, which is in the water with its huge, vast body weight supported by the water itself. And I've been filming them in Venezuela, in the swamps. We'd had no luck whatsoever. And on about our 3rd day, we were going down this trail and we saw the trail of an anaconda going from one pool to another. And my guide said, "Oh, well, it's in that pool. Quick, go in, snorkel, and you might be able to see it underwater." And so I thought, well, he's the expert. All right, I'll give it a go. So I put on my swimming goggles and I went into the pool and I swam around in this pond looking for an anaconda, knowing that there were hundreds of crocodiles and the world's biggest snake in this pond somewhere, thinking this is just madness. And we didn't find anything. And I got out and I said to the guy, "Wow, that was really scary. How often have you found anacondas like this?" And he went, "Never. You have to be a mentalist to go in there." But it did give me the idea that actually, you know, this snake lives its whole life in the water, and in some places they live in quite clear water. There was no reason why we couldn't try and film this animal underwater for the first time. So the following year, we went back and we found a place in Brazil where the water runs out of the mountains, very clear and very cold, and sometimes these big snakes will lie up on the riverbanks. They sort of look like a massive discarded truck tire. And if you get close enough, they'll slide into the water, and you can slide in too wearing your scuba gear, and you stand a chance of getting a shot of this incredible animal, 6 meters of serpentine, extraordinary joy on the bottom of a swamp. After about 3 or 4 days, we saw our first big anaconda, and she did go into the water, and we followed her afterwards. And the experience we had on the bottom of this swamp, it was like something out of a Hollywood B-movie, seeing these tangled roots and this huge snake slithering in between them. But the most extraordinary thing was that she didn't swim like a sea snake or like a water snake in this country. Instead, she emptied out her lungs. Most snakes have only one single lung. This one has 2. Emptied her lungs out and moved along the bottom in exactly the same way as a large snake would do on land. And even more extraordinary than that was the fact that she was coming up to a molt. Her eyes were completely white and clouded, so she couldn't see anything at all. She was functionally blind. But she flicked out her tongue and tasted the water around her in exactly the same way as she would do as if she was on land. And I've been studying snakes since I was knee-high, and every single thing that I saw in that 3-minute encounter with this huge snake was completely new to me, and it was an incredible learning experience. So that's number 1, anaconda. Anyone else got another animal? A shrew, okay. How's about this? There are shrews in this country. The water shrew that we have in this country is one of the only venomous mammals in the world. Admittedly, it's not a venomous bite that's going to do us a tremendous amount of harm, but it can be used to incapacitate their insect prey, and it is believed that this might be something which is a throwback to a time when we had proto-mammals that might all have been venomous. So you find animals now like the solenodon, which is a massive great kind of shrew that's found in places like Cuba and is still venomous, and it's believed that that could be what the majority of mammals were like right back at their inception when the dinosaurs were still ruling the planet. So the little shrew that we have running around in this country with a metabolism that is so rapid that it needs to eat half its own body weight every single day or it will simply cark it, is in its own way a throwback to the very beginning of the first ever mammals. Give us another animal. A scorpion. Scorpion's a good one. This is great. Keep going with things like scorpions and snakes and I'll be fine. Scorpions, there's about 1,000 different species of scorpions. Only a handful of them can do us any harm whatsoever. And the best way of telling if a scorpion is dangerous or not is to look at the tail and the pincers. If the pincers are massive, then it uses those for munching down its prey, which will be things like millipedes and cockroaches. If the tail is massive, then it's packed with venom, and that's the one that you don't want to stand on. Actually one of the best ways, scorpions are a really good animal for me because at night time they give away their presence by the fact that their skin fluoresces under ultraviolet light. So if you carry around a little UV torch and you flash it into the thatched roof of the kind of place that you're staying, or maybe onto certain kind of palm trees, all of a sudden these tiny little glowing shapes like fluorescent toys will show up, and there will be scorpions. Dolphin. Dolphins, okay, so the Pacific spinner dolphin has 262 teeth, which is the record for any mammal. Atlantic bottlenose dolphins have one of the largest brain to body size ratios of any animal whatsoever. So you look at dolphins, the largest species of dolphin is the killer whale. It's an animal that can cover 100 miles in a single day. And think about the fact that you're taking an animal that essentially is probably as sentient as we are as human beings, and in many cases keeping them in a swimming pool with a constant white noise in the background, despite the fact they're an animal that communicates with everything else in its pod solely by sound. And you are essentially doing exactly the same as taking one of us, putting us into one of those portaloos back there and playing us white noise all day long. And that's why the idea of keeping dolphins, killer whales in captivity is insanity and unbelievably cruel. Another animal. Alpaca make glorious scarves. Cats, did someone say cats? Cats, okay. Is anyone here a cat owner? Yes, okay. I hate you. And your house smells of we. No, in all seriousness, we have about 9.5 million cats in this country, and they're wonderful animals. Cats are incredibly exciting predators, but the way that we handle our cats is potentially one of the greatest challenges to native wildlife in this country. 9.5 million cats. Some of those will bring home as many as 100 prey items in a year. You don't have to do a tremendous amount of mathematics to see that if you have a cat and you allow it to roam free without any kind of restriction on its movements, then it is going to decimate local wildlife. And that's not just small mammals, it's not just the rats and the mice that we want to get rid of. It will be songbirds, it will be newts, it will be slow worms, stag beetles. One of the great things that is reducing our population of stag beetles, our most dramatic insect, is purely the fact that we let our cats run free. As simple as keeping your cat in at night will reduce their predation of native wildlife by as much as 70%. Nothing else. You don't have to do anything else other than keep your cat in at night, and you are doing our local wildlife a favour. Another animal. Did someone say Komodo dragon? Oh, I love you. That's a great story. Komodo dragon, I tell you what's really interesting about Komodo dragons is that until recently it was believed that we only had 2 species of venomous lizards in the world, the beaded lizard and the Gila monster. And then a scientist called Dr. Brian Greg Fry did some analysis of Komodo dragons and found that they too have a very, very strong venom. It was believed until recently that they had lots of bacteria in their mouths. They bite their prey would get a massive secondary infection and keel over dead in a couple of weeks, but it's been discovered that they have actually got venom glands in their lower jaw and a venom that is just as potent as you'd find in a king cobra or a Russell's viper. It just works very slowly. So Komodo dragons are found to be venomous, and it's now believed that a huge amount of other monitor lizards, which is the same family, are also venomous. Anything else? What was that? Flamingo? Sperm whale! Sperm whale. Okay. So this will be my last story. My last story will be about sperm whales. One of the most special encounters that I've ever had with an animal was with sperm whales in the island of Dominica. It's in the Caribbean, and it's somewhere that particularly female sperm whales come and spend time with their calves in close to shore. And very occasionally, you'll get a female sperm whale that will want to introduce its young to the new things that come into its environment. If you're very lucky, that can be you. A couple of years I was working there filming, and we had this one particular female. We called her can opener because she had a big chunk taken out of the back flukes of her tail, and she would repeatedly come up to our boat with her calf. I mean, it seemed in comparison to her tiny, but it was, you know, bigger than a cow, and she was bringing it up to us, very obviously saying, "Look at these intruders into our world, you don't have to worry about them." And the most extraordinary thing was that while I was interacting underwater with this animal, they constantly send out sounds into the water. They send out sounds in the same way that a bat will do, and as the sounds bounce back off solid objects in the environment, they detect it in their lower jaw, and they build up a three-dimensional picture of the world around them. And as she turned towards me, you can feel it resonating right through your body. You can feel it in every single airspace. And then she started dancing with me. And this is the Strictly connection, because we had this remarkable sort of pas de deux, almost like a ballet underwater. Every single movement that I would do, this 15, 20-ton sperm whale would exactly replicate. So I was doing circles underwater, and she'd do circles too, and I would try and do kind of somersaults, and she would exactly mirror my movements. And at the end of it, she'd turn over onto her side and look at me with her eye, and there was a connection there, a connection of sentience and intelligence that I will actually take with me to my deathbed. Any moment that a wild animal deliberately seeks out your company and seeks to interact with you is something that is so special you cannot even begin to put it into words. And that is, I would say, one of the best moments of my life. So thank you very much for shouting out sperm whale. I really appreciate it.
Well, the Transglobe Expedition Trust was set up about 25 years ago in order to raise money to give to young expedition people, going to interesting parts of the world, doing interesting things, very often helping local people when they get to remote areas, that sort of thing. And we have trustees, all of whom we meet up, not very often, but at these charity events. And they're usually very good fun. They're usually people of pretty much all ages who still want to get out there and do interesting things. Thank you very much for coming, because you're supporting what a number of us, geriatrics and the younger generation as well, have been working on. Just to give you the background of it, I got brought up in South Africa, and when we came to the UK, I couldn't get A levels, basically because at that time was the height of the mini skirt era, and concentration was not possible. So I failed the A levels twice, and therefore I went into the army, which is what people do when they can't have A levels. So couldn't get to Sandhurst, so I went to the other place called Mons, but you don't get a regular commission. So I went into tanks in the Cold War in Germany, and I spent 5 years in tanks learning how to withdraw from the German border. It's got quite boring. So when I saw a notice about the SAS, I put my name down, not because I knew anything about the SAS. In those days, nobody had ever heard of them. It was before Harold Wilson started to use them for PR purposes. I had obviously heard of Scandinavian Airlines services, so I got to Hereford, 190 people trying to get into the regiment, and very lucky I did get into it. But you then have a course when you have to, sort of selection. And during that, we were told to do a plan to rob the local bank in Hereford, which the SAS check your plan after. And by the time I got down to the bank, it was already closed. So I could not get in to do a careful burglary plan. So I went round the back of the bank and banged on the window, and the bank manager luckily came out. A charming bloke, very naive. And I explained that I'd come from Germany. I had brought all my family silver with me. This bit was not true. And he said, no problem, we at Barclays are very secure. He showed me all the electronic burglar system, so I thanked him. And in those days, carbon paper, I copied the bank raid plan, one copy to the SAS, and me and the other guy had the day off. So we went up to Birmingham, we had a spaghetti dinner, and stupidly, I left my copy of the bank raid plan in the restaurant. And the manager, later in court, basically, the police took the plans. There was a ministerial inquiry in Westminster why SAS officers were stealing from banks. I was up for the commanding officer, who basically said any more behaviour and I would be thrown out of the SAS immediately. Well, for the next year or two in the regiment, in odd parts of the world, doing odd things, I behaved pretty well. But sadly, back in the UK, I got rung up by an old Eton friend, who by that time, like most of them, had become a wine salesman in the West Country. And during the course of selling his stuff in pubs down there, he discovered a beautiful village which had just been voted Britain's prettiest village by the Americans. And it was being attacked by 20th Century Fox making a film in this beautiful village called Dr. Dolittle, which basically involved turning this lovely trout stream, thatched cottages, into a dirty great lake for filming on. And my friend decided it was a 20-foot concrete dam ruining the village, so he decided to blow it up. And he rang me up to see if I could help and so on and so forth. But basically, at the last minute, the police discovered the plan and they put Alsatian dogs all over the dam. But my friend had been at Eton, so he got one. What he did was to rent 8 Alsatian bitches in order to put them upwind of the dam. But at the very last minute, the bitches failed to turn up, so he phoned me to ask if I would stand in. I had just been doing an army explosives course where you learn to blow up as much as you can using as little as possible. And I was pretty good at this, so I had a lot left over at the end of every day. And it seemed stupid to give it back to Her Majesty, so I put it in the boot. And 2 months later, the boot was full and sweating. And what better way of getting rid of it than this public spirited gesture? Unfortunately, everybody was caught. I was not physically caught. I'd been doing another army course on escaping from dogs by night. But they had the car numbers. I ended up in prison. I was on police probation for 6 months. I was thrown out of the SAS back to my own regiment, who was still retreating from the German border. Well, I put up with that for about another year, and then I saw a notice asking for officers to apply for the Sultan's army, at which time there was a D notice. It wasn't reported. And I spent 3 years with the Arabs fighting the communists out there. And then I got thrown out of the British Army after 8 years because I hadn't got a regular commission, hadn't had A levels, and that was the rule. No regular commission, you're out after 8 years. I had no money, I got married. And the only thing that we thought we might be able to do was that in Germany in the Cold War, I had been training Scottish soldiers how to canoe and climb and ski in order to stop them beating each other up in the nappy. Very bored because the Soviet army never bothered to attack. Now, that was called adventure training, and it was paid for by the taxpayer, but doing it with my wife was not. So the new word became sponsorship. That was the key to everything. Nobody had ever heard of us. We had to start small. We did the first ever complete journey up the longest river in the world, which was the Nile, 4,000 miles long. She decided at breakfast that that's what we would do. In the Guinness book, she saw that there was a thing called a hoverhawk, a prototype, 1968, and that it had 3 motorbike engines. It had a record in the Guinness book of having hovered for 8 hours without a breakdown around a gravel pit in Peterborough. So it's obviously the right model for the Nile. It had 3 motorbike engines, could lift it 2 centimetres above the surface. We completed the Nile in 9 months, partly because there were a lot of 4-centimetre obstacles. In the early days, we did 15 expeditions in different parts of the world, mostly hot. But suddenly, I think about 1971, Anton will remember, things changed. We could no longer get sponsorship because the media would not cover hot expeditions, which is what we did. You had to go cold. So by then we had spent an entire winter in Fiennes, but to go polar was a big step. So she decided again at breakfast that what we would do would be the first ever journey around Earth vertically, 52,000 miles without flying 1 meter of the entire journey. And so she sent me to a library to find out the best route. I discovered that there was a white bit at the bottom called Antarctica, which did not look good. It had never been crossed by a single expedition from one side to the other. I'm talking polar experts. We knew anything colder than sort of Dartmoor, really. And so that was what she decided. There was another problem which we came across up at the top, 2,500 miles of floating ice over the North Pole, crossed only by Wally Herbert, who'd taken 2 whole years to do that little bit out of the entire journey. Anyway, that was her idea, so I went off to the library, you maybe would, and told Ginny that it was a stupid idea. She became quite unpleasant, so I therefore went back to the library. But basically, you've got to be first, as you here know. Being second, you will not get sponsorship. You've got to be the first. So we were in a hurry, but we didn't have any money. We had a Jack Russell Terrier and a black minivan, and the SAS gave us an office. You need an office to get sponsors. We had to have 1,900 sponsors. We worked every day, every week, every month for 7 years, unpaid, working at weekends in pubs to make a living. And that was to follow Ginny's dream to do the first ever journey around the world. We needed to have a ship because the Atlantic and the Pacific get in the way. And so Ginny advertised, free obviously, in a newspaper. And the first bloke that came along, where is he? Anton Bowering? The bloke in the blazer over there, looking shy. And Anton, this was, I think, well, you can work it out, 1973, over 40 years ago. Anton came in, he looked very scruffy. When he left, Ginny shook her head at me, and he said he would like to be deckhand on the polar ship. So eventually he came in a second time, and Ginny said, you can be our deckhand. So he said, where's the ship? No, he said, your first job can be to get an ice-strengthened ship. How much can I spend? There is no money. We have no money. Even the drawing pins you see with the maps, they were sponsored by a drawing pin company. Everything is free. So he said, what about the crew? They'll have to be Lloyd's Class 1 for a thing like that, specified, otherwise you're not allowed, you won't get insurance. So we're talking chief engineers of great experience. So Ginny said, well, you can find them, but as long as you don't pay them. The journey will only be 3 years, so you know they can probably go without money for that long. So Anton took that on, and off he went. And a little bit later, like 7 years later, when we were recruiting the last ones of the crew, basically, and I don't mean to upset anyone here or be politically incorrect, but it was stupid to have women on that ship because there were all those men for 3 years, particularly if that woman was pretty, not a good idea. Murder. So anyway, Ginny agreed with that. And so we said, right, no women, but we had a committee. As you'll know, you have to have a committee of learned people, ex-admirals and so on like that, Prince Charles' patron and so on. And they said, no, that is politically incorrect. You will take women if they advertise. If they answer your advertise, they're prepared to do it for 3 years for nothing like the men, you will take women. Anton sort of nodded at them, but eventually there was a woman who was the patents officer from Whitehall. She applied and she stuck at the applications, and there was nothing we could do. She was the cook. She was going to be for 3 years the cook on the expedition. Anyway, the ship left Greenwich. By the time it got down to Cape Town, last stop for Antarctica, 2 of the crew were already madly in love with her. She was pretty, which made it even worse. And so by the time Ginny and me and the 2 other guys got dropped off on one side of Antarctica, prior to doing the first complete crossing, it's bigger than China and India, and the ship would see us on the other side. They would wait 18 months in the hope that we would come out. Obviously in those days we were using the sun and your watch for navigation and Morse code. Ginny was the Morse code radio operator. And the last thing we saw of the ship before they left us there was Ginny said to Anton, you're going to have to get rid of her. There will be murder. You won't be able to come to collect us in 18 months if she stays on board. Anyway, to cut a long story short, we crossed Antarctica, got to the other side, the ship comes in from New Zealand to collect us. First thing Ginny says to Anton, so what do you do with her, you know? And he looked really shamefaced and he said, I married her. During our Antarctic crossing, Ginny, one of the organisers with red hair, was conceived. And she's now one of our best trustees 39 years later. So a great number of people on that expedition are here this evening, and what we have done, what Anton started doing with his father and other members of his team, was to start the Transglobe expedition about, I think, 20-something years ago. And what we do is we make money, and thank you for buying tickets. And every year we have something at the Royal Geographical Society. Speakers come and do it for us free, which is wonderful. And what we do is we regurgitate the money or whatever and give it to deserving expeditions.
I think when I think of cycling around the world, the main memory I cherish is quite a generic one of just the kindness of people in the world. It was a very human experience, and I set off quite nervous about potential bad people in the world, but the kindness and generosity from strangers, rich and poor, all over the world was extraordinary and humbling, and that was definitely the highlight of the experience.
Thank you, Ed, for inviting me here tonight. This is one of the coolest events I've ever had the nervous privilege to speak at. You've come here this evening, you want to hear about Ran's decades of escapade, you want to hear tales of gold medals and Steve and Ed's great expeditions, their adventures, their TV careers. I know exactly how it feels to want to come to events like this because I've spent quite a lot of my time doing exactly that. When I was at university, I got very excited because Ranulph Fiennes was coming to do a talk, so I went along to this talk. I was very excited, looking forward to hearing the talk. At the end of the talk, I went up, I was clutching in my hand a copy of his book, and I went up to ask for his autograph. I actually wanted to ask lots of questions about how to become an adventurer, but I didn't dare, so I just asked for his autograph. I gave him the book, and it was a very, very old copy of Living Dangerously, and he looked at this book and he said, "This is a very old copy, you must be a very long-standing, devout fan of mine," or something like that. I didn't dare tell him that I'd actually bought it in the charity shop for 50p that morning, because it was a lot cheaper than the ones he'd be flogging that evening. But Sir Ranulph, thank you, you've inspired me to begin this crazy life that I'm trying to do now. And tonight I want to talk about how I went from enjoying talks and events like that to actually starting to try and do them for myself. And I think that's the only difficult part of the adventure, the expedition world, is that, going from the dreaming of it to the actually doing of it. And so if any of you are daydreaming of adventures tonight, I want you to try and watch the talks tonight and remember this. It's quite easy to look at the people speaking tonight, not myself, the other people, to see these trophies of frostbitten digits and gold medals and just think, wow, these people are not like me. But what you have to remember is this. Ran Fiennes pulled a sledge for the first time, once. Helen and Heather, they rode for the very first time once. Steve, he did his first dive, his first climb. Everyone is a beginner at some point. Even Ed used to do trips with his clothes on. Everyone begins somewhere. So back when I was trying to get away with my 50p book, I had dreams of adventure, but I had no talent, no skills, and absolutely not really much cash either, being a student. So I needed to try and find some sort of adventure that required no talent, no skill, and no cash. I had a think, and I came up with the idea of trying to cycle around the world. Cycling around the world is a very simple thing to do. It's not necessarily easy, but it's a very simple thing to do. But the biggest thing that was getting in my way at that time was my self-doubt, thinking, I've never done anything like this, therefore I can't do something like this, and also society deems that I should be doing something much more sensible with my life, and also what if I go and fail and look like a loser? And then I thought to myself, I'm already a loser, so I might as well just get going. I got on my bike, waved goodbye to my family, set off, pedaling off down the road, and I realised within about the first minute of my trip, as I burst into tears, that this was not the sort of thing you read about in autobiographies by Ranulph Fiennes, Reinhold Messner, Steve Redgrave. I was definitely cut from a different sort of cloth. To my surprise, I hadn't given up by the time I made it to Africa. I rode down from England down to Africa. I arrived in Sudan. There I was going to have to cross a desert. I'd never been to a desert in my life, so I was very scared about that. I'd been to the beach. That was the limit of my desert training. To my surprise, I made it down to the bottom of Africa, hitchhiked on a boat across to South America, spent a year and a half cycling from Patagonia to Alaska, hopped over to Siberia. Then I spent 3 months cycling through Siberia in the wintertime, temperatures down to -40. In my normal talks, this is where I start to ramble off subtly, trying to show off about how incredibly tough I am. But I'll leave that little bit out this evening, except to say that 3 months in Siberia, at the time, was the worst thing I've ever done in my life. It was unbelievably terrible. It was definitely type 2 fun. And now, years later, I look back on it and I think, those were the best days of my life. There's a lot of rose-tinted stories to do with the adventuring world. By the time I got home, I'd cycled 46,000 miles, which is almost like doing 2 laps of the equator. It took me just over 4 years to do, and the whole trip around the world cost me just under £7,000. And I got home and I realised I've now done an adventure. I've actually done something. And the hardest thing of all with adventures is doing the first one. Getting number 2 off the ground is so much easier. You start to get a bit of momentum. So I set off to row across the Atlantic Ocean. I realised quickly, though, that rowing is a very unappealing combination of being brutally hard and bloody boring. 2 hours of rowing, 2 hours rest, 2 hours on, 2 hours off, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, until you get to the other side of the Atlantic was enough to make me decide I didn't want to do any more rowing. So I decided to try and do a couple of long-ish walks. I walked across southern India, I walked through the empty quarter. Walking is slow, painful and miserable, and I realised that if I carried on doing trips like that, then the logical progression would eventually mean that I would end up bald and naked. So I thought I need to stop I need to stop doing walking trips. So then I took up ballroom dancing. I didn't really. That is a preposterous thing for any adventurer to do. I realise now that my talk is basically taking the mickey out of people who can all beat me up. I apologise for that. This is the confidence of being on stage. Now, actually, I did something even more preposterous than ballroom dancing as an adventurer, which was to stop having big adventures and to do quite a change in direction. Because by then I got to the point where I was starting to call myself an adventurer, and I realised that people had this strange perception whereby people would think that you need to be an adventurer in order to have adventures, which struck me as ridiculous because I'm a very normal person who just happened to choose to do these sort of things. So I decided I wanted to try to show normal people, all of us, that you don't need to disappear to the ends of the earth to have some sort of adventure. You can have an adventure anywhere. It's just about your attitude, doing something different and difficult and exciting, and that can happen anywhere, even in the most boring places in the world. So I decided to try and do the most mundane adventure I could think of, which was to walk a lap of the M25. Walking a lap of the M25 ticked all of the boxes that cycling around the world had done. It was a physical challenge. It took me places I'd never been before. I found pockets of wilderness and beauty in amongst it all. I met good, kind people. And round about Junction 17, it was in January, so it was very snowy, round about Junction 17, Rickmansworth, I'm good on my junctions now, I found a child's sledge, loaded my sledge into it, loaded my kit into this kid's sledge, and for the first time in my life felt like a proper, genuine polar explorer as I hauled my sledge through the snowy wastelands of Rickmansworth. So that was my first micro adventure. I loved the experience, and I realised that what I wanted to try and do is to try to look at the constraints in all of our busy lives that stop us having the adventures that we might dream of doing. Perhaps some of you here tonight might be planning to go and do something massive, but a lot of us are happy with normal lives and just want to try and squeeze adventure in amongst the busy realities of our lives. So I wanted to try and find what stops people having adventure, and then to try and suggest to people that to try and see the opportunities that remain rather than just to get a bit downbeat about the constraints in our lives. For example, canoeing down a river is a great thing to do, but canoes are a pain. You have to buy them, you have to find somewhere to put them, you have to drive them to the river and then dump them and then take your go up to the source, and then you go back down to drop off where you're going to get in, and then you go back there and you realise your keys are there and your paddle's there and you haven't even started canoeing. It's just such a nightmare. So a much better idea is to buy a few tractor inner tubes, get 4 tractor inner tubes for 50 quid, drift down a river with your friends. If you do not enjoy that, you have no soul. Nobody in Britain lives more than 70 miles from an ocean. If ever you're feeling a bit down in life, a good thing, Ed might disagree with this after being on a desert island, but I would suggest that a good thing to cheer yourself up is to see the sea. No one lives more than 70 miles from the sea. Jump on a bike one weekend, cycle to the sea, sleep on a beach, cycle home. If you want to go running, if you set out from your house and run a 5-mile circle around your home, you've done a 40-mile run. That's a pretty hearty run, exploring within just 5 miles from your home. You don't need to go far to have an adventure. And what I've been trying to do is boil down the micro-adventure idea, make it simpler and simpler and simpler, because whenever anything's a bit complicated, people come up with some sort of excuse why they can't do it. So I thought, what are the things that stop people having adventures? And I think mostly it is a lack of time, a lack of money, a lack of expertise or equipment, and a geographical limit. You live in suburbia rather than Siberia. And so I wanted to make an adventure so simple that really none of those excuses count. And if you still don't do it, then that's just because you're lazy, not because you've got any valid reason. And this idea I came up with is the idea of a 5 to 9 overnight adventure. Instead of getting bogged down by the 9 to 5 and the constraints of that, instead of seeing that as a negative thing, why not flip that round and see what opportunities remain when you leave work at 5 o'clock until 9 o'clock the next morning, 16 hours of hypothetical freedom. What can you do in that time? And my suggestion is this. One evening, when you finish work, instead of just going home to watch telly or rubbish on the Discovery Channel or something, what I suggest you do is get on a bus, head out of town, and go sleep on a hill for a night. Sleeping on a hill, I've decided, is all you need for an adventurous life. Sleep on top of a hill, sleep under the stars, watch the sunrise the next morning, run back down the hill, jump in a river. Jumping in a river is good for the soul. Get back on the bus, back to work, back to your desk for 9 o'clock the next morning. And then, when your boss says to you in the morning, did you do anything interesting last night? For once, you don't have to lie. For once, you can say, yes, last night I had an adventure. So for me, micro-adventures are the starting point for adventures. They can be large ones or small ones, but you've got to get started. Right, what was the point of my talk? Yes, the point of my talk was this. Beginning a project is the hardest part of all. The only hard thing about cycling around the world was summoning up the nerve to set out and begin. And if you don't have the time for a 5 to 9 overnight micro-adventure, then you will never get round to crossing Antarctica. You'll never go walk the length of the Amazon. And that might be fine, but it's important to acknowledge that, I think. And my final thing I want to say tonight is, if any of you are dreaming of some sort of adventures, is don't think of yourself as being different to these other crazy speakers tonight. Don't feel that you are excluded from the adventurers' party. If you want to have a massive adventure, you can. You've just got to ask yourself these 3 questions. What do you want to do? When are you going to begin it? And what tiny little thing are you going to do tomorrow to get yourself started on that journey to the adventure? Thank you very much.
I thought to myself, as I was thinking, what shall I talk about, that this last 3 years have bizarrely been extraordinary in terms of my own inner exploration. So tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about the effects of isolation and what it can do to you. For those of you who don't know, I followed up the Walk in the Amazon walk with an experiment. I put myself on an uninhabited desert island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean for 2 months, for 60 days. I didn't have any food, I didn't have any water, I didn't have any equipment, didn't have a knife. Bizarrely, didn't have any clothes, and I didn't really know how I would fare, I have to say, and that was the point of the whole thing. I like adventure TV, but I thought, wouldn't it be more interesting if someone just was put through it for real? So that was the concept, simple as that. When I arrived on the island, I've got to face this way so the wind doesn't catch the microphone. When I arrived on the microphone, I didn't arrive on the microphone, did I? Shit, it's going really well. When I arrived on the island, there was a little boat with a Fijian boatman, and there was a producer-director who was filming me step off the boat, and before I stepped off the boat, he said, Ed, it's time, take your shorts off. And I was like, really? And I had to take my shorts off, step out of the boat naked, walk up the beach with my pelly case and my little camera. And then the boat like started the outboard motor and then disappeared off. And I was left standing on the beach. And I've got to be honest, I thought I was going to get lonely on that island after about maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks. I couldn't think. I was in such a state of panic immediately that it was like I'd been in a car crash or something, or I'd been in an extreme shock situation. The most basic things, I'd got a radio mic, which normally like this one, you pin it on your shirt, and then I started to set up the radio mic, and then I realised I was naked and there was nothing to pin it to, and so I then pinned it to the camera. But the point of a radio mic is that it's remote, and so if you're linked to the camera with a cord, my brain was spinning, and I think the point is that I was utterly blown away by the overwhelming lack of control that I had immediately I started the experience. And I tried to limit it down. Basically, I decided, okay, the only thing I really need to do today in order to survive is to pin a coconut and drink coconut water. So I did that. I hadn't realised, and I think everyone suffers this to a greater or lesser extent, how much I have sort of developed my sense of self based on what other people think of me. And I think part of this completely and utterly overwhelming sort of realisation was that for the next 60 days, there was going to be no feedback at all. There was going to be nobody patting me on the back or criticising me or encouraging me or laughing with me or at me. And it was just me. And I think the enormity of that, I think the enormity of knowing that you were going to get no feedback at all just completely spanned me out to the extent that I was literally stood on that island going, who the fuck am I? I really don't know. It was terrifying. Bizarrely, you would think at that point, that's a good time to sit down and look at yourself and work out what's going on. I was too scared to do so. I went into this very unconscious stage, which lasted for most of the time on the island, of keeping myself busy. I had 2 months on this island to do anything I wanted to film it in any way I wanted to. I had no schedule, no structure, but I put so much time pressure on myself. I basically planned out the whole days. I had little 5-minute breaks every hour. I had certain schedules that I made myself stick to, and I got really stressed if I didn't stick to my schedules. I made up stuff in my head to distract me from this feeling that I was trying to avoid from. Sometimes this got too much, utterly too much, and I just couldn't continue. I'd spoken a little bit about it. I've got some Aboriginal friends. I've got really lovely friends in Australia, and they said, don't underestimate 60 days on your own, Ed. It could drive you completely mad. And they gave me a little tip, which was to make a circle out of stones, and when I found myself spinning out, was to go and sit in that circle. And they said, if you go and sit in that circle, you'll be safe. You'll be completely safe. And I just like laughed at them and then got onto the island and span out massively. And so immediately ran around looking for stones and made myself a little stone circle and went sat in it. And it was extraordinary. Like I sat down and my shoulders just went, ah. And I just suddenly was able to come into myself and stop worrying. Aboriginals believe that you've got 3 brains. You've got your biggest brain is your gut, your instinct, your soul, essentially. Your second biggest brain is your heart and your emotions, and the smallest brain is your logical brain. And they think that all Westerners are crazy because they live in their logical brain the whole time. And actually, the word that they use for the logical brain is called nandupuru, which also means if a fishing net is all tangled up and fucked and beyond repair, they call it nandupuru. And that's the same word that we use for our logical brain. So they said, like, if you stay in your logical brain for the entire time on the island, you've got no hope at all. It's like, it's not that you're crazy, you're just using a dysfunctional part of your body in order to operate. And so what they tried to do is to get me to come from a sort of more animalistic place of being, I suppose. And this worked up to a point, but I think I have to say, just from a personal perspective, I was still in a place where I was just a little bit too scared to sit with myself. It sounds really bizarre. The thing that I found the most terrifying on the island was just to sit on my own in silence and experience my actual feelings. I just kept trying to distract. As a result, even though I'd had this training, the island experience was a roller coaster for me. Because I had no one to bounce off, I didn't have my sense of self determined by other people, but because I hadn't worked out me yet, I wasn't determining that either. And so essentially whatever happened determined whether I was happy or not. So if I light a fire, I'm happy, and if suddenly I can't find any food, I'm down. And I went up and down like this. And Tigress Productions, who made the TV program, said, fucking hell, that was a nightmare, because you were happy, then sad, then happy, then sad, and they had to sort of group them all together and make a slightly less crazy program out of the whole thing. I think isolation in itself isn't something that drives you crazy. I think if you've got, let's face it, who in today's world doesn't have a few fucking issues going on in their head? I think if you haven't, fair play to you, and you can probably go into isolation and not have any bad effects. Sarah Ooten, amazing woman who's rowing across the ocean that Transglobe is sponsoring at the moment. She doesn't have many issues. She can deal. She bangs on about Mars bars quite a lot actually, but she doesn't really have any issues, and she deals with isolation really well, and I admire her massively for that. I think at the time I did, and I as a result struggled. I think isolation is just like a mirror. If you've got demons going on, there's nowhere to hide. Isolation will just dig them out. When I came home, I sort of pretended it was all a big success, but I didn't really feel like I'd really conquered the island because I couldn't sit with myself. So to cut a long story short, I decided to continue opening that can of worms that had been opened, and I decided to start an even bigger sort of exploration or adventure or journey or whatever you want to call it, and I entered psychotherapy, which I've done for the last 18 months. And I have to say that this isn't a sob story at all. This is the most positive thing that's ever happened to me. Facing anybody's fears in life seems the most terrifying thing to do, and yet the moment you decide to do it and you look at it, invariably it's not half as bad as you thought it was, and in my case it certainly wasn't half as bad as I thought it was. And the place that it's left me in now, as a result of going onto the island, going through an extraordinary amount of turmoil, but then being almost forced into a place where I had to look at things, is so lovely. I used to live a life where I think it would be fair to say that, how should I put this? Because I didn't have any sense of self, I would do stuff to make people think certain things of me so that they would then say things to me, and then that's what I'd think. Like, I walked the Amazon to prove to you that I'm really tough. You come to me and you go, Ed, you're amazing, you walked the Amazon, therefore I know I'm amazing. It's bonkers, it's utterly bonkers. But having come through that whole rigmarole, I genuinely now can stand in front of you and go, I don't really mind if you think this talk's boring, because I know within myself who I am now, and it just allows every relationship that I have to be a truer one. I'm not trying to manipulate anyone to like me or dislike me. I just feel like a far truer version of myself. And although that's not a conventional adventure story, I thought that was more applicable for this evening. So that's my story. Thank you.
I think any event that's going to sort of help anybody achieve their dream or give them any opportunity to do something extraordinary is just fantastic. I think we've been given so many opportunities in doing what we do, and to even think that this, money you raise tonight could be the beginning of somebody else's dream is great.
You get to be inspired. We all need a bit of inspiration in our life, honestly. We need other people. I've been inspired by Ranulph Fiennes, Ed Stafford, Al Humphreys, Helen and Heather and Steve. They were like huge inspirations to me, just because they've decided to go out there and say, I'm not going to live a conventional way of life. I am going to be a bit different. I'm going to break the norm, and I'm going to go out there and still live a pretty awesome existence during the short time we get to live on this planet,
I'm really happy with the way tonight has gone. I wasn't expecting there to be such a positive response to what was a exploratory evening, really. We didn't know whether people would respond to this sort of event, and people have turned out in the middle of nowhere into a field, and the atmosphere has been phenomenal. I'm touched, I would say, by the whole event.
I just want to say thanks to all of the speakers who have come this year, all of the volunteers that have helped set up, all of the punters who have come and paid tickets, and I just cannot wait to do this again next year.